You know, sometimes I think that these people who are rushing somewhere now, never raising their heads, they don't even realize that there is a whole other world below, under our feet. Not just tunnels and cars. There, in the darkness, live their own legends, their own stories, which no one speaks out loud. I've heard them for as long as I can remember. Some of them were told to me by my grandfather, who worked on the construction of the first lines. And you won't believe it, but each of them has its own grain of truth. Do you want me to start? Just don't interrupt. And make sure your coffee doesn't get cold while I'm telling you. Have you watched this one, like his Meat Train? Wow, I was so moved. Can you imagine? I was talking to a taxi driver recently, and he told me a story. He says that every self-respecting taxi driver knows that there are ghost cars on some subway lines. They say that they appear out of nowhere and take people into the darkness. You know, there was this actor who played in that movie about pills that pump the brain 100%. Like his Limited, or something like that. I don't remember the name, but he played so cool there. The taxi driver said that this story happened much earlier than that movie was made. I didn't believe him, but he assured me that it was true, and it made me remember a very similar story. They say that some places exist on the periphery of the real, where the veil between what is and what was, or perhaps what could be, grows impossibly thin. Autumn Gate Station, they whisper, is one such place. Not listed in any official timetable, not marked on any map you'd find in a bright, well-lit precinct, it is a relic, a phantom limb of the city's sprawling rail network. And every night, precisely when the last scheduled train has pulled away, leaving the platforms desolate and echoing, it arrives. You might find yourself there for any number of reasons. Perhaps you missed your connection, the cruel irony of a delayed flight pushing you beyond the bounds of normal transit. Perhaps a forgotten appointment, a misread schedule, or even a simple, profound disorientation after a particularly long and draining day led your weary steps to this specific, chillingly quiet platform. It matters little how you arrive, only that you do. They say it's never a conscious choice to seek it out, but rather a gravity, a subtle, irresistible pull towards the chill wind that always seems to stir at Autumn Gate, even on the mildest nights. You remember the feeling, don't you? The sudden prickle of unease that settled upon you the moment you stepped onto the empty platform. The lights, though functional, seemed to cast a dim, jaundiced glow, barely chasing back the encroaching shadows. The air itself felt heavy, tasting of damp earth and disuse, a stark contrast to the usual bustle and metallic tang of a working station. A profound quiet enveloped the place, a silence so complete it felt like a presence, watching. You might have checked your watch, confirming the late hour, or perhaps pulled out your phone, only to find the signal mysteriously absent, the screen a useless, glowing rectangle in the oppressive dark. And then, in the distance, a low rumble would begin. It wasn't the familiar, reassuring roar of a modern locomotive, but something deeper, older, like the earth itself groaning. The tremor grew, vibrating through the forgotten concrete beneath your feet, not sharp and mechanical, but a heavy, resonant thrum. You would crane your neck, searching the black ribbon of the tracks, a shiver chasing its way down your spine that had nothing to do with the intensifying cold. Then you would see it. A single, dull light barely piercing the gloom, growing steadily larger. It was a train, unmistakably so, but unlike any you had ever seen. The locomotive was a hulking, archaic beast, black as pitch, with an anachronistic smokestack that seemed to gasp rather than puff. There was no whistle, no bell, no metallic squeal of brakes. It simply glided into the station, a spectral leviathan, the wheels making an odd, hushed clatter on the rails, as if they were made of bone rather than steel. It stopped with a deep sigh of air brakes, a sound that seemed to come from its very core. The light on its front blinked out, plunging the immediate area into deeper shadow. Its carriages stretched down the platform, an unbroken line of dark, identical boxes. You noticed, with a growing sense of dread, that there were no markings on the carriages, no company logos, no destination signs. Not a single window was lit from within. They were just dark, empty voids. The doors, however, hissed open, one by one, along the entire length of the train, revealing nothing but impenetrable blackness inside. A strange compulsion would seize you then, a quiet urging that burrowed past your logic and fear. You would tell yourself that you had no other option, that this was simply the last train, late, perhaps a special service, though your instincts screamed otherwise. You might have hesitated, a knot of icy dread tightening in your stomach as you glanced around the utterly deserted platform, hoping for some sign of another soul, a conductor, anyone, just to confirm your sanity. But there would be no one. Only you, the silence, and the gaping, empty maw of the train. They say that the moment you choose to step onto that platform, to approach those open doors, your fate is sealed. They say that a person in your position might whisper to themselves, asking if this was truly the way, but no answer would ever be offered, only the cold, beckoning void. You took a deep breath, the air surprisingly stale even out on the open platform, and stepped across the threshold. The floor of the carriage felt solid enough, but the interior air was colder than outside, a penetrating damp chill that seemed to seep into your very bones. The seats, an antique velvet, were faded and dust-laden, arranged in pairs facing each other, but every single one was empty. The carriage was immaculately, terrifyingly vacant. No other passengers could be seen, no luggage, no lingering scent of human presence, only the faint, metallic aroma of rust and something else, something indefinable and cloying, like old memories. You chose a seat, perhaps one near a window, hoping for some external reference, some anchor to the world you knew. The moment you settled into the cold fabric, the doors along the length of the train began to hiss shut, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed through the empty carriages, each closing door a soft thud like a coffin lid. You might have felt a sudden, desperate urge to reach out, to stop them, an instinct to escape that flared too late. But they closed, sealing you inside the silent, moving tomb. With another deep, resonant thrum, the train began to move. Slowly at first, a gentle lurch that barely disturbed your seated form, then picking up speed with an unnatural swiftness. The clatter of the wheels against the track grew louder now, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that seemed to pound directly into your skull. You pressed your face to the window, peering out, but the landscape rushing past was an indistinct blur of black and gray. No familiar streetlights, no distant glow of the city, just an endless, featureless void dissolving into motion. You might have felt a pang of profound loneliness then, a horrifying realization of your absolute isolation. You were utterly alone in this cold, speeding behemoth. You likely tried to stand, perhaps to walk through the carriages, to find some emergency lever, some sign of life, but a strange inertia seemed to hold you in your seat, your limbs heavy, your resolve dissolving into a primal, paralyzing fear. And then, as the train gained an impossible speed, blurring the outside world into a dark smear, they began to appear. Not outside, not in the passing landscape, but in the windows of the other carriages. At first, you might have dismissed it, a trick of the light, a reflection, a figment of your overactive imagination. A fleeting shadow, a distortion. But then another appeared, and another, until every window in the carriages ahead and behind you, and indeed, even in your own reflection in the window beside you, was host to a face. They were pale, translucent, pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. Their eyes were wide, vacant and pleading, fixed on something unseen, or perhaps fixed on you. Their mouths were open, stretched in silent screams, or contorted in desperate, voiceless pleas. You could see the subtle contours of their features, the lines of anguish etched into their spectral skin, the terror in their wide, unblinking gazes. A woman with hair like tangled seaweed, a man with a broken nose, a child with tear streaks on ghostly cheeks. They looked like people, just like you, but utterly drained of life, of color, of hope. You would feel a cold dread bloom in your chest, blossoming into a full-blown panic. You'd recognize the truth of what they called the autumn gate train. These were the ones who got on, the ones who never returned. These were the previous passengers, trapped, forever passengers, their spectral forms tethered to this ceaseless journey. Their faces pressed closer, their silent entreaties growing more urgent, more terrifying. They begged, they pleaded, their phantom hands seemingly reaching through the glass, not to harm you, but to implore, to warn, to share their endless torment. Let us out, their silent mouths seemed to declare. Let us out of this dark, cold place. The absolute horror of it would be overwhelming. You might recoil, pressing yourself against the back of your seat, trying to look away, but their faces were everywhere. In every window, reflected in the polished metal of the luggage racks, even shimmering faintly in the glass of the overhead lights. Their eyes, those wide, begging eyes, would follow your every move. It was not a physical threat, not a monster in the conventional sense, but a chilling, soul-deep terror of absolute, inescapable confinement to an eternal, hopeless journey. You would realize that the faces were not just external. Looking into the glass before you, your own reflection, once clear, would begin to warp. Your own features would twist, stretch, your eyes widening with the same desperate terror you saw in their spectral faces. You were becoming one of them, your living essence slowly draining, replaced by the same translucent despair that clung to the windows. The landscape outside remained a terrifying blur, a non-place, a void that offered no hope of arrival, no destination, no escape. The relentless, rhythmic clatter of the wheels intensified, becoming the very pulse of your growing despair, echoing the silent screams of the faces that now surrounded you, that were becoming you. They say that if you ever find yourself on that train, there is no getting off. There is no stopping it. There is only the journey, ceaseless and cold, and the company of those who made the same fatal choice. And as the train gained yet more speed, carrying you deeper into the boundless dark, you would know, with a clarity that pierced your very soul, that you had bought a one-way ticket to an eternity of silent pleading, forever pressed against the glass, begging to be let out, just like all the others. And the train would continue to hurtle onward, through the dark, through the cold, never stopping, never arriving, a phantom train carrying its ghostly passengers to a destination that was no place at all. It never stops, they say. Not truly. And perhaps, as you look out into the endless night, a new face, pale and desperate, would have taken its place in the windows, watching the blur, forever seeking an impossible release. You know what's the scariest thing about this story? It's not about monsters. It's about loneliness and despair. About how a person can fall into a trap without even realizing it. But that's only one side of the coin. The subway is a whole world full of forgotten secrets. And not all of them are hidden in trains that go nowhere. Some are hidden on tracks that lead nowhere. There's one such story about a forgotten fifth track. Listen closely. This isn't a fabricated tale, nor a flight of fancy spun from late-night shadows. No, this comes from a place where the city's pulse truly beats, deep beneath the concrete and steel, within the forgotten arteries of the old subway lines. You might think you know these tunnels, the rumbling trains, the grime, the hurried faces. But I tell you, there are secrets even the oldest engineers deny, stories whispered only in the dead hours, when the last train has gone and the tracks lie silent. They speak of a fifth track, a phantom limb of the sprawling network, a line not marked on any modern schematic, a deviation so old and so subtly buried that it eludes all but the most obsessive. You see it, don't you? Imagine the labyrinthine guts of the city, a place where light struggles, a place where time itself seems to slow, clinging to the damp concrete. And there, tucked away, almost swallowed by subsequent renovations and forgotten history, lies this aberrant path. No maintenance crew is officially assigned to it. No train has run its length in decades, perhaps a century. The official line is that it doesn't exist, a relic of an ill-conceived plan, walled off and forgotten. But the old-timers, the ones who've spent their lives down there, they know. They speak of an unusual chill, a subtle draft, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonates from a place the blueprints insist is solid rock. They say it leads somewhere. Somewhere that should remain undisturbed. This is the story of Henry. You might picture him, a man built for the subterranean world. Broad shoulders, steady hands, a face etched with the grime and the wisdom of countless shifts spent coaxing ancient machinery back to life. He was a repairman, one of the best, with an almost uncanny knack for sniffing out anomalies, for hearing the subtle groans of stressed metal that others missed. He possessed a quiet, almost restless curiosity, a trait that would, in time, lead him to a place no living soul was meant to tread. He had heard the whispers, of course. All the repairmen did. Tales of a section of the tunnel where the air grew heavy, where the old-timers would inexplicably drop a tool or forget a procedure, shaking their heads as if to dislodge an unwelcome memory. He'd always dismissed them as the usual tunnel lore, born of sleep deprivation and the oppressive solitude. Yet, a seed of genuine intrigue had been planted. He found himself drawn to that specific, unmarked section, lingering a little longer, his powerful work light sweeping the crumbling walls, searching for the invisible seam. It wasn't a grand, dramatic discovery. No, that wouldn't be the way of it. It was slow, insidious, like the encroachment of rust. He noticed the wall here seemed a little too new for its surroundings, a patch of concrete that didn't quite match the time-worn patina of the rest of the tunnel. He learned that the official record simply stated a structural reinforcement project had sealed off a collapsed section decades ago. But something about the story felt thin, incomplete. He started discreetly probing, using his brakes to explore the very edge of the known, always with an eye over his shoulder, ensuring no foreman or colleague saw his private obsession. He knew they would tell him he was seeing things, suggest he needed a vacation. But the conviction grew within him. He found a faint seam, almost invisible beneath layers of grime and dust, perfectly camouflaged. It wasn't a wall, he realized. It was a door, a seamless, expertly disguised barrier. And he told himself that he had to know what lay beyond. One night, several weeks into his furtive investigation, he carried a small, specialized drill, not part of his usual kit. He waited until the last train had passed, until the hum of the city above had receded to a distant thrum, until he was absolutely alone in the echoing darkness. You can feel the tension, can't you? The heavy silence, broken only by the drip of unseen water, the scuttling of rats, and the frantic beat of his own heart. He worked slowly, meticulously, a barely audible drone filling the void as he cut through the cleverly concealed lock, then carefully pried open the heavy, rusted panel that had masqueraded as a solid wall for so long. A gust of air, stale and cold, sighed out from the opening like the breath of something long dormant. It was different from the usual tunnel air, lacking the metallic tang of the active lines, carrying instead a scent of dust, damp earth, and something else, something indefinable, ancient, and deeply mournful. He shone his light inside. And there it was, the fifth track. It ran parallel to the main line for a short distance before veering sharply away, disappearing into a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb the very light of his powerful beam. The track was rusted solid, encrusted with decades of decay, the wooden ties underneath rotten and crumbling. Overhead, the cabling hung in tattered shreds, swaying slightly in the phantom draft. He noticed it almost immediately, the utter lack of modern equipment. This section of the tunnel was entirely untouched by the march of time that had renovated and updated the rest of the network. It was a perfect preserved tomb. He took a breath, the air tasting like history and something akin to dread, and stepped onto the forgotten ties. The metal groaned faintly under his weight, a quiet protest. He told himself that he was being foolish, that it was just an old, forgotten section of the tunnel, nothing more. But the silence here was different. It wasn't the quiet of an empty space. It was the quiet of a space that was holding its breath. As he ventured deeper, the main tunnel completely vanished behind him, swallowed by the curve of the forgotten line. The air grew perceptibly colder, a clammy chill that seeped into his bones despite his heavy overalls. His flashlight beam danced ahead, revealing an increasingly dilapidated path. The walls were uneven, scarred with ancient cracks, shimmering with patches of black mold. He saw the occasional skeletal remains of an old tool, a forgotten lantern, artifacts from another era. Then he saw the first one. A handprint. Dark, almost black against the grimy concrete wall. It looked fresh, wet, as if someone had just placed their palm there, yet it was distinctly old, stained into the very fabric of the tunnel. He brushed his gloved hand over it, his brow furrowed. It felt dry, completely integrated into the surface. He attributed it to some odd mineral stain, a trick of the light. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that the tunnels were full of strange geological formations. But then he saw another, and another, appearing seemingly out of nowhere, sometimes high on the wall, sometimes low, sometimes a single print, sometimes a faint, ghostly pair. They didn't glow, they didn't pulsate, but their very presence resonated with an eerie permanence. He tried to wipe one away, rubbing hard with his gloved finger, but it remained, stubbornly imprinted on the ancient wall. It wasn't paint or grime. It was there. The track continued its slow descent, the air growing heavier, laden with an almost tangible sense of sorrow. It wasn't menacing, not aggressive, but a deep, profound sadness seemed to permeate the very stone. He felt an inexplicable pressure on his chest, a yearning. He found himself walking slower, more cautiously, his flashlight beam sweeping not just for obstacles, but for the next impossible mark. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A faint glow in the distance, a diffusion of light that wasn't his own. It grew steadier, revealing not an end to the tunnel, but an opening. He was approaching a station. An abandoned station. You can imagine the sight, can't you? The platform, still tiled in a style long out of fashion, crumbling at the edges. The rusted tracks stretching alongside, two on either side of the platform, parallel to the line he had followed. The station name, etched into a faded sign above the platform edge, was so obscured by grime and time that he couldn't decipher it. The advertising posters on the walls were nothing but tattered fragments, indecipherable whispers of forgotten products and services. Everything was shrouded in a thick layer of dust, an undisturbed blanket of decay. This wasn't just an unused station, it was a place frozen in time, preserved in the very moment it had been abandoned. And the silence here was absolute, deeper even than the tunnel leading in. He stepped onto the platform, his boots crunching on loose debris, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. And then he heard them. At first, he thought it was the wind, whistling through some unseen vent. But there was no breeze, and the sound was too complex, too distinctly human. It was a low, murmuring chorus, like a vast crowd speaking in hushed tones, each voice indistinct, overlapping, a tapestry of sorrowful sound. He strained to hear individual words, but they remained just beyond the grasp of his understanding, a constant, mournful drone that filled the cavernous space. It was not threatening, but profoundly unsettling, like being surrounded by silent mourners you couldn't see. His light swept across the platform, the waiting room, the stairwells leading up to nowhere. And everywhere, on every surface, the palm prints. Hundreds of them now. On the tiled walls, on the ticket booth window, on the rusted turnstiles, even on the very floor where people would have stood. They pulsed with a silent, spectral energy, appearing and reappearing, as if the very air was leaving behind these ghostly imprints. And then, in the murky distance, At the far end of the platform, he saw them. Shadows. Not the sharp, defined shadows cast by his own light, but the indistinct, shifting silhouettes of people. They moved slowly, purposefully, as if in a trance, walking along the platform, some standing near the edge as if waiting for a train that would never come. They were vague, translucent, like smoke given a momentary form, yet unmistakably human. They were moving towards the stairs, towards the unseen exits, just as people would have done after disembarking a train. Their forms were indistinct, their clothing archaic, but their posture, their very movement, echoed the patterns of a bygone era. They were going to work, or coming home, or simply existing in that eternal, tragic loop. He stood frozen, his breath hitched in his throat, his powerful flashlight beam wavering. He didn't feel fear, not exactly. It was something far deeper, far more primal. A chilling recognition. These were the souls. The ones who had died here, in the terrible accident that had prompted the sealing of this very line. They were the echoes of that disaster, forever trapped in their final, mundane acts. They were waiting, going, existing in an endless, futile pantomime of life. The whispers seemed to grow louder, coalescing into a more distinct, though still unintelligible, murmur. He felt as though he could almost hear their individual lamentations, their frustrated attempts to communicate. He thought he heard his name, or something like it, carried on the spectral breeze. He saw a new palm print shimmer into existence right beside him, a dark, ghostly handprint appearing on the concrete pillar he was leaning against, its fingers reaching slightly upwards, as if in longing. He decided then that he had seen enough. More than enough. He felt a profound sense of intrusion, of having trespassed into a grief that was not his to witness, a tragedy that pulsed with an eternal, quiet despair. He turned slowly, not in a panicked flight, but with the heavy, deliberate movements of a man carrying a great weight. He didn't run. He walked. He retraced his steps, the whispers following him like a mournful echo, the palm prints seeming to multiply with every flicker of his light. He didn't look back, but he felt the presence, the silent, sorrowful gaze of the souls watching his retreat. He pushed through the concealed panel, sealing it behind him with a final, echoing clang that seemed to disturb the very fabric of the tunnel. Henry never spoke of what he saw. Not directly, at least. He still works the tunnels, his face perhaps a little more weathered, his eyes a little more haunted. But you might catch him sometimes, if you watch closely, sweeping his light a little too lingeringly over that section of the wall, or listening intently to the distant hum of the tracks. He might, on an unusually quiet night, tell you that some places beneath the city hold more than just forgotten grime. He might even tell you that some things are better left undisturbed, some histories better left buried under concrete and silence. They say the palm prints still appear on that long-forgotten track, even on its sealed-off entrance. You might even find one, if you know where to look, if you're brave enough to seek it out yourself. A dark, ghostly imprint, appearing out of nowhere, only to fade slowly, silently, like a whisper on the wind. And you, listening to this tale, can almost feel its cold impression on your own skin, can't you? A reminder that some deaths are never truly laid to rest, but simply wait, in the deepest, most forgotten parts of the world, for someone to finally listen. You see, the scariest thing about these subway stories is that they never end. They continue even when you leave, like those souls stuck in the eternal tunnel. But not all the secrets of the dungeon are just sad echoes of the past. Some of them are alive, and they are waiting for their prey. You must have heard of the underground rivers that flow under our city? Well, they say that they hide something more than just dirty water. They say that they hide hunger. You know this city, don't you? You've walked its streets, felt its ceaseless pulse beating just beneath your feet. You've probably even heard the old whispers, the half-truths people tell themselves about the vast, unseen network of rivers and forgotten streams that flow, an unseen circulatory system, deep beneath the labyrinth of concrete and steel. Everyone knows they're there, these subterranean waterways, ancient and indifferent, carving their paths through the bedrock. But you, like most, have likely never spared a thought for what might live in them. No, that's a different kind of knowledge, a colder, deeper understanding that only a few ever brush against, and fewer still live to truly comprehend. Let me tell you a story, one I heard from a man who swore it was the truth, a tale whispered in the hushed, cavernous spaces where the city's light dares not reach. He spoke of the subway tunnels, those colossal arteries that thrum with life during the day, carrying their endless cargo of humanity. But at night, when the last train clattered its way to the depot and the power flickered low, a different kind of life stirred. He said, with a haunted look in his eyes, that this was when the true dwellers of the deep emerged. Imagine, if you will, the profound silence that descends upon the tracks after the city sleeps. The air thickens, heavy with the scent of ozone and damp earth. It's in these moments, he told me, that certain drains, the wider, older ones, often bricked in forgotten sections or feeding into deeper, older conduits, begin to whisper. They don't just carry water, they are gateways. From these orifices, he described, there crawled creatures unlike anything you've ever imagined. They were, he said, like men, but not men. Humanoid in form, yes, but their skin was slick and pale, often mottled in shades of gray and green, like ancient stones stained by algae. Their limbs were long, perhaps too long, ending in what he could only describe as webbed digits, fingers, and toes that spoke of a life spent in perpetual currents. Their eyes, he swore, were the most unsettling part, large, lidless, and glowing faintly with an internal luminescence, perfectly adapted to the sunless depths. He had heard them called many things, these things, but amphibians was the closest approximation he could offer, though it barely scratched the surface of their ancient, alien presence. These weren't just predators, mind you, moving through the subterranean veins of the city. He explained that they were also the guardians. Guardians of those very rivers, hidden from human eyes for millennia, protectors of realms we have long forgotten even existed. They maintained a delicate, horrifying balance, ensuring that the rivers remained pure, undisturbed by the surface world, and that the chosen few who ventured too far, well, they simply became part of the current. Our story, the one I'm telling you now, centers on a man named John. He was a creature of the night himself, one of the countless lost souls who found solace and a semblance of shelter in the city's forgotten corners. John had made his home in an abandoned subway station, a cavernous space choked with dust and the echoes of trains long past. It was a place where the air hung heavy and still, a sanctuary of sorts from the biting winds and indifferent eyes of the world above. He had, the man told me, a certain quiet dignity about him, despite his circumstances. He wasn't violent or loud, just present. At first, it was subtle. John would sometimes wake, he recounted, to an inexplicable chill that seeped into his bones, even on nights when the surface world was mild. He described a pervasive dampness, far beyond the usual subterranean humidity, that clung to the air like a shroud. And then there was the smell. A strange, fishy odor, not quite putrid, but undeniably aquatic, like a forgotten tidal that would wax and wane with the hours, sometimes almost imperceptible, other times overwhelmingly strong, making him wrinkle his nose and cough. He dismissed it, of course, as the natural effluvium of the old tunnels, the decay of the city's long-buried infrastructure. He told himself it was just the damp, just the smell of old pipes and the river water seeping through cracks. But then, the disappearances began. They weren't immediate. At first, he would simply wake up in a different spot than where he lay down. Not far, just a few feet, as if he had sleepwalked, or perhaps, he mused to another vagrant who sometimes passed through, he had merely stirred in his sleep and shifted. But then he would find his meager belongings, an old blanket, a half-eaten can of beans, a worn boot, wet. Not merely damp, but soaked. as if pulled from a cold bath. And those footprints, he described them as long, narrow, and peculiarly splayed, somehow too large for his own feet, and yet undeniably there, leading away from his sleeping spot, always toward one of the massive, grimy drains that punctuated the station's lower walls. He'd stare at them, he later confessed, with a growing knot of unease in his gut. He tried to rationalize it. He suggested to himself that perhaps a burst pipe was leaking, explaining the wetness. The footprints? Maybe another homeless soul, perhaps drunk, had stumbled through, leaving behind a mess. He said he tried to believe these things, to make sense of the inexplicable. But the fishy smell would intensify on these mornings, clinging to the damp air, undeniable and unsettling. John soon began to feel a profound sense of not being alone. He recounted how the shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce and shift at the periphery of his vision. He started staying awake longer, nursing his flickering candle, trying to pierce the gloom that pressed in on him. He often spoke of hearing sounds, faint at first, like liquid sloshing, a soft, guttural croaking, or the almost imperceptible scrape of something heavy and wet dragging across the concrete. He told a passing soul, so the story goes, that it sounded like something moving in the walls, or perhaps, from under the tracks themselves. One night, he swore to the few others who would listen, he saw it. A flicker. A movement in the absolute darkness beyond the reach of his candle, a pale, almost phosphorescent glow that vanished as soon as he focused on it. He described it as fleeting, like the reflection of water on distant eyes, but it was enough. It was enough to shatter his peace, to replace his weariness with a stark, cold dread. He recounted how his blood ran cold, how he felt a predatory gaze fixed upon him from the unseen depths. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was exhaustion, the tricks of the light in the cavernous dark. But he truly believed, he whispered, that it was real. His sleep became fitful, punctuated by nightmares of being dragged down, of cold, dark water closing over his head. He tried to barricade himself, piling up old crates and debris around his sleeping spot, a futile attempt to keep out whatever was watching him. He often spoke of the futility of it, how illogical it felt, trying to bar a creature of the dark with a few flimsy planks. Yet he felt compelled to try, a primal instinct for self-preservation warring with the chilling certainty that it wouldn't be enough. He told anyone who would listen that the barricades felt more like a cage, trapping him with whatever lurked. The wet footprints became bolder, appearing closer to his makeshift bed, sometimes right beside his head. He recounted finding a small, flat stone one morning, covered in fresh slime, placed deliberately on his overturned boot. He picked it up, he said, and the fishy smell was overwhelming, almost burning his nostrils. He later confessed to a shuddering fear, a feeling of being toyed with, understood and observed. He explained that this was when he started to know, deep in his bones, that he was being hunted. He knew, he felt, that they weren't just passing by. They were interested. One especially dark and oppressive night, a night he later described as feeling like the very air was pressing down, John was awake, clutching a rusty pipe he'd found, his eyes wide and scanning the oppressive shadows. He claimed to have heard soft, slushing sounds, becoming clearer this time, emanating from the largest drain at the far end of the station. He recounted how his heart hammered against his ribs, how a cold sweat broke out on his brow despite the chill. He watched, transfixed, as two pale, glowing points of light slowly emerged from the black maw of the drain. He described their ascent, slow, deliberate. First, the eyes, like twin phosphorescent moon discs in the pitch. Then, the slick, mottled head, vaguely conical, but with a wide, lipless mouth that seemed to stretch unnaturally. He noted their lack of outer ears, simply smooth indentations on either side, and the faint, almost translucent membranes that covered their eyes, blinking horizontally. He was able to discern the outline of their bodies now, elongated and unsettlingly slender, yet powerful, moving with an eerie grace. He said he saw the long, webbed fingers, tipped with what looked like blunt, flattened claws, gripping the slimy edges of the drain and the concrete wall. There were 3 of them, he later whispered, their forms catching what little ambient light reflected from the distant street above. They moved with a silent, aquatic fluidity, not walking so much as slithering, their bodies rippling as they covered ground. He recounted how the fishy smell became so potent it made his eyes water, thick and cloying. He held his breath, he said, trying to make himself invisible, trying to disappear into the very shadows that were now their domain. He explained that they didn't rush. They seemed to possess an ancient patience, an unnerving slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden charge. They spread out, flanking him, their glowing eyes never leaving him. He could almost hear them thinking, he later mused, a silent, telepathic hum that vibrated in his very bones, telling him he was known, he was observed, he was chosen. He said he tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He tried to move, to run, but his limbs were paralyzed by a cold, absolute terror. He understood then, he later recounted with a shudder, that these were not mere animals. They were intelligences, ancient and primal, with a purpose far beyond simple hunger. They were not just predators. They were collectors, guardians of a realm he had unwittingly trespassed upon for too long. He knew, he explained, that they were finally here to claim him for the rivers, to reclaim what they considered their own. His last coherent memory, as he recounted it to the man who then told me, was of the closest creature. It had paused mere feet from him, standing taller than he had initially perceived, its head cocked slightly. He described its gaze as intense, almost inquisitive, devoid of malice but filled with an ancient, implacable will. He said it extended one long, webbed hand towards him, not in aggression, but in an invitation. A silent summons. He felt a profound, chilling pull, a sensation of his very being unraveling, being drawn towards the cold, dark water it represented. He remembered vividly the cold, smooth touch of its webbed fingers on his arm, a touch that, he said, felt strangely familiar. Like coming home to a place he didn't know he'd left. And then, John was gone. The man who told me this story, he explained that he had gone back to the abandoned station a few days later, drawn by an uneasy curiosity. He found John's makeshift bed still there, his few meager possessions untouched. But no John. Only a single trail of intensely wet footprints, far more pronounced than any before, leading directly to the gaping mouth of the largest drain. The footprints were accompanied by a powerful, almost suffocating fishy smell that hung heavy in the stale air, a scent that seemed to permeate the very concrete. The trail didn't end at the drain. It seemed to vanish into it, as if the water itself had swallowed the prints, and the man who made them. He said he peered into the darkness of that drain, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the subterranean air. He saw nothing but black, rushing water, heard nothing but the distant, echoing gurgle of the unseen river. No sign of John. No struggle. Just the wet footprints, the fishy smell, and an undeniable, profound absence. The man who told me this story, he ended it there, with a shrug and a profound look of unease. He told me he never saw John again. He never saw the creatures again, either, not so clearly. But he said that sometimes, at night, when the city is quiet, and the last train has run, he thinks of John. He thinks of those underground rivers, flowing beneath us all, ceaseless and cold. And he wonders, as he hopes you will too, what kind of guardian John truly became. And what ancient, hidden realms now lay open to him, realms we can only ever dimly perceive from the surface, if we're unlucky enough to look too closely. The scariest thing about John's story is the realization that there is another world beneath the city, with its own laws and its own predators. It is a world where man is only prey. But it is a physical fear, the fear of flesh and bone. There is another kind of horror that cannot be seen, but it can be heard. It is hidden not in the rivers, but in the walls themselves. In all these kilometers of concrete that lie beneath us. They say that these walls are not just building material. They are graves that hide screams and whispers. You know, it's a strange thing, the way old stories cling to places, especially those built on the edge of the known world, deep beneath the earth. I heard this particular tale from a man who swore on his grandmother's grave it was true, a man whose eyes, I can tell you, held a weariness that only comes from looking into places no human was meant to see. He spoke of a certain metro station, deep in the city's labyrinthine underbelly, where the air itself seemed to hum with forgotten sorrows and the echoes of time stretched like thin, vibrating wires. According to him, the workers there, the mechanics, the engineers, the cleaning crews, all of them, at some point, encountered the phenomenon. Not just a draft or the groan of ancient pipes, but sounds. Whispers, he told me, so faint at first they could be mistaken for the wind sighing through the tunnels, a mere suggestion of sound. Then, clearer, distinct, like the rustle of silk or the brush of a phantom hand against the concrete. Sometimes, he recounted, it was the sound of distant, mournful crying, a child's wail perhaps, echoing from the tracks where no child should ever be. Other times, it was a low, chilling laughter, playful yet utterly devoid of joy, seeming to bounce off the very walls that held it captive, a sound that, my source explained, made the hair on one's arms stand perpetually on end. The strangest part, my source insisted, was that no one ever saw the source. No shadow, no figure, no fleeting glimpse around a bend in the tunnel. Just the sounds, disembodied and spectral, coming from the depths where the trains ran, or sometimes, from the unlit service tunnels that snaked off into the city's forgotten arteries. It was as if, he explained, the very air itself had learned to speak, but only when no one was looking directly at its mouth. The men in the station had their own explanation, passed down from generation to generation of tunnel diggers and track layers. A grim legend, really, but one that seemed to grow more solid with each strange sound heard. They said that these were the voices of the lost souls, the men and women who had vanished during the station's brutal construction, swallowed by cave-ins, crushed by falling debris, or simply bricked alive into the very concrete walls they were building. Immured, as the old stories called it. Their spirits, so the tale went, remained trapped, forever looking for a way out, forever reaching for life. Their cries for help, their last desperate words, their final moments of terror, forever replaying in the dark. And this is where the real dread began, my informant cautioned. These restless spirits were not merely echoes. They were hungry. They could, he said with a shiver that seemed to ripple through his very core, drag someone who listened too long, someone who paid too much attention, someone whose own soul was perhaps already a little lost, into their cold, concrete afterlife. Into the dark, where the only company was the chorus of the forgotten. Allow me to tell you about Victor. He was one of those men, a night shift supervisor, a practical man who dealt in schedules and safety checks, in the clang of metal and the rush of air. He had spent close to 15 years working underground, in and around the very station where these legends stirred. When he first heard the hushed stories from older colleagues about the phantom sounds, he would just shake his head and suggest they cut back on the coffee, or perhaps get more sleep. He was a man, you understand, who believed in what he could see, touch, and measure. The tunnels, to him, were systems of steel and rock, not haunted catacombs ripe with the specters of the dead. He would walk the length of the platforms during the late hours, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet, the smell of ozone and damp earth always in the air. He would check the tracks, inspect the signal lights, and make sure the station was ready for the first morning rush. My source explained that initially, Victor had never heard anything out of the ordinary, apart from the expected creaks and groans of a century-old structure settling against the Earth's immutable pressure. The old-timers, he relayed, would exchange knowing glances when Victor was within earshot, sometimes whispering amongst themselves that he hadn't heard them yet, implying a rite of passage for all who work deep beneath the city. Then it started. It began subtly, as these things always do, my source elucidated, like a melody played on the edge of hearing. One evening, Victor was conducting a routine inspection, deep in a rarely used service tunnel that branched off from the main line, a place where the soundscape was usually dominated by the hum of distant machinery and the rhythmic thrum of the ventilation system. He thought he heard a faint sigh, like someone exhaling close beside him. He paused, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, but saw nothing. He attributed it to a trick of the acoustics, or perhaps, he told himself, he was just tired, his ears growing oversensitive in the profound quiet. A few nights later, while overseeing some track maintenance during an overnight closure, he became aware of a low, almost melodic hum. It was distinct from the metallic groans of the heavy machinery and the shouts of his crew. It sounded, he mused, like someone humming a wordless tune, a lullaby perhaps, coming from further down the unlit tunnel, where the light of their work lamps could not reach. He asked one of his junior technicians if he heard anything unusual, and the young man had just shaken his head, reporting only the normal operational noises. Victor, my source said, dismissed it again, deciding his senses were perhaps overstimulated, or his imagination, for the first time in years, was running wild. But the incidents grew in frequency, gaining an insidious momentum. He started hearing what sounded like faint weeping, always from just out of sight, always when he was alone. A short, sharp sob, then silence. A child's whimpering, barely audible over the distant rumble of trains on another line. He would stop, listen intently, but the moment he focused, the sound would dissipate, leaving only the oppressive quiet of the underground, punctuated by the frantic beat of his own heart. He never spoke of these growing occurrences to his colleagues, not wanting to invite their knowing looks or their "I told you so's." He still clung to the belief that there was a rational explanation for everything, a loose pipe, an air current, the stress of the job manifesting in auditory hallucinations. He was, my source explained, a man drowning in his own rationalizations. The whispers, my informant recounted, were the most insidious. They started as an indistinct murmur, like a crowd of people talking just beyond a thick wall, a soft, buzzing energy in the air. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, they began to coalesce into something more. He would be walking past an access panel, or inspecting a junction box, and he would hear a cluster of voices, just for a second, right beside him. He couldn't make out words, not clearly, but the implication of speech was undeniable, the cadence and rhythm of human voices. It was as if, he was told, they were always just on the verge of revealing a secret, then pulling back, testing his resolve, teasing him. One night, while standing on a deserted platform, waiting for a delayed supply train, he distinctly heard his name called. "Victor," it whispered, a soft, sibilant sound, emerging from the blackness between the tracks, a sound too intimate to be a gust of wind. His heart, he confessed to himself later, had leaped into his throat, a cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting a wide arc through the empty station, but there was nothing. No one. He was completely, utterly alone. He clutched the heavy steel lamp, his knuckles white, and told himself it was the draft, the wind playing tricks. But the voice had been too clear, too specific. It had been his name, whispered with a familiarity that chilled him to the bone. After that night, the rules changed. The sounds stopped being random atmospheric anomalies. They started to feel directed. My source explained that Victor began to notice a pattern. The whispers would intensify whenever he was in a particularly isolated section of the tunnels, or whenever he was feeling particularly stressed or lonely. The crying seemed to follow him down certain corridors, and the laughter would rise and fall with his own anxieties, a mirror to his internal state. It was as if, he thought with growing horror, they were responding to him, learning him, adapting to his presence. His colleagues began to notice a change in him. Where he was once jovial and straightforward, quick with a joke or a practical solution, he became withdrawn, prone to long silences, and often seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. He would occasionally turn his head sharply as if someone had just spoken to him, even when no one was there. When asked if everything was all right, he would just mumble something about being tired, or the headache, his eyes darting quickly to the dark mouths of the tunnels. One of his fellow supervisors, a gruff man named Boris, apparently told my source that Victor looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or worse, was listening to one, perpetually engaged in a silent, terrifying dialogue. The real horror, as my informant conveyed it, was when the whispers began to address him directly and clearly. They knew things. They knew his name, of course, but then they started speaking of his past, of small regrets, of missed opportunities, of the quiet disappointments he carried within him. He would be checking the pressure gauges in a ventilation shaft, and a chorus of soft, yearning voices would seem to rise from the grates, saying, "Poor Victor, you should have taken that other job, shouldn't you have?" Or, "Such a lonely man, always alone in the dark, aren't you?" It was not malicious, not exactly, but insidious. They spoke with a seductive sadness, often offering him release. "It's so much quieter down here, Victor." A child's voice would lilt from the darkness ahead, the sound both innocent and ancient. "Peaceful. No more schedules. No more deadlines. Just rest." They would promise him an end to the weary routine, an escape from the crushing weight of responsibility, from the world of the living. They spoke of understanding his burdens, of knowing his loneliness, echoing thoughts he had never shared with anyone, not even himself. He started trying to talk back to them, my source recounted. Not out loud, not at first. He would silently challenge them, demanding to know who they were, what they wanted, his mind racing against their unseen presence. But they would only respond with more whispers, more enticements, more things that only Victor knew about himself, confirming their unnatural knowledge. He became convinced they were inside his head, or that the thin veil between his world and theirs was disintegrating, fraying like an old shroud. He started avoiding the more isolated sections of the station, volunteering less for deep tunnel inspections. But it was no use. The voices were no longer confined to the furthest reaches. They began to intrude everywhere. He heard them on the main platforms, faint but persistent, blending with the echo of distant trains. He heard them in the break room, just at the edge of his hearing, when his colleagues were talking loudly. He heard them in the hum of fluorescent lights, and in the silence of his own apartment. And the laughter, that chilling, joyless laughter, would bubble up from beneath the floorboards of his office, seemingly just for him, a private, tormenting accompaniment to his days and nights. He was losing sleep. His eyes, my source noted, always looked bloodshot and shadowed, perpetually widened with a silent terror. He would come to work looking pale, his hands trembling slightly, clutching his thermos of coffee like a lifeline, as if the warmth could keep the cold at bay. He tried to tell his supervisor, the one who had made the comment about ghosts, that he was hearing things. But he couldn't articulate it properly, only managing to stammer about voices and whispers that he couldn't explain. His supervisor, concerned, suggested he take some sick leave, perhaps see a doctor. Victor, however, refused, explaining that he needed to keep working, that he couldn't leave the tunnels. He couldn't leave them. My informant suggested that by this point, Victor felt bound to them, a horrifying connection forged in the dark. The voices, my source explained, were becoming almost physical now. He would sometimes feel a cold brush against his cheek, or the sensation of a thin, spectral finger tracing patterns on his arm, always accompanied by a new, more urgent whisper. "Come closer, Victor. We are waiting. Just a little step." A profound, magnetic pull, deeper than any physical force, began to assert itself. He was terrified, but also, disturbingly, drawn in. There was a morbid curiosity, an awful fascination with these entities that knew him so intimately, that seemed to offer such a complete, if terrifying, understanding of his inner life. He found himself lingering in the darker corners of the tunnels, straining to hear the clearer whispers, trying to decipher their meaning, to understand their promises of peace. He often found himself standing at the edge of the tracks, looking down into the deep, dark abyss where the main tunnels snaked away, and he would hear a chorus of voices begging him to jump, to join them. "It's so easy, Victor. Just fall. Let go." He started to bring a small, old-fashioned rosary to work, clutching it in his pocket like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. But even as he did, he heard the faint, derisive giggles coming from the walls around him, mocking his futile attempts at prayer. He told himself it was just a trick of his mind, a hallucination, but the conviction was as hollow as the tunnels themselves. He knew deep down that they were real, and that he was losing the battle. His fear mutated into something else, something closer to a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was tired of fighting them, tired of resisting. The constant mental battle was draining him, leaving him hollow, a shell of the man he once was. The voices had chipped away at his sanity, piece by piece, like water eroding rock. My source suggested that Victor had begun to view them not just as a threat, but as a peculiar, dark form of companionship. They were the only ones who truly seemed to see him, to know him, in the suffocating isolation of the underground. And in his profound loneliness, that was a dangerous, alluring thing. The night it truly came to a head, as my informant related it, was a night of particularly heavy rain above ground, which only seemed to amplify the oppressive atmosphere below. Victor was alone in a far-flung maintenance passage, deep in the absolute silence between train services. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and metallic tang. He felt, my source said, an almost palpable presence around him, a pressure in his chest, as if the very air was a thick, unseen hand pressing down on him. The whispers began, not faint now, but clear and resonant, as if coming from inches away. A multitude of voices, both child and adult, male and female, all speaking at once, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled his entire skull, deafening him to anything else. They knew a specific secret from his childhood, a forgotten trauma, a regret so deep he had buried it even from himself, a memory he hadn't consciously thought of in decades. They spoke of it with a chilling understanding, almost coaxing. "We know, Victor. We know your pain. Let it go. We can take it away." Then, a single, dominant voice emerged from the chorus. It was a woman's voice, my source described, soft and alluring, yet filled with an ancient sorrow that echoed his own. It seemed to come from the very wall beside him, from within the cold, unyielding concrete. It called his name, and promised him ultimate peace, an end to suffering, a final embrace in the dark. It said that all he needed to do was to step a little closer, to touch the wall, to let them take him. It described a world where his weariness would vanish, where he would finally belong, forever free from the burdens of the living. Victor, my source explained, felt an irresistible pull, a profound longing to surrender. He raised his hand, his fingers trembling, reaching for the cold, unyielding concrete wall. The whispers intensified, becoming a crescendo of welcoming sounds, a chorus of relief and anticipation, a triumphant song of capture. He felt a coldness emanating from the wall, a deep, pervasive chill that seemed to seep into his very bones, promising oblivion, an end to his torment. He felt as if unseen hands were reaching out from within the solid rock, grasping at his spirit, urging him forward, into the eternal darkness, into the endless quiet promised by the voices. My informant didn't know what happened next, not precisely. He only knew that Victor was found the next morning by the relief shift, slumped against that very wall, his eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead into nothing, a faint, contented smile playing on his lips. He was still alive, technically. But some part of him, my source insisted, was gone. Vanished. Pulled into the concrete. Victor never returned to work in the tunnels. He was institutionalized, the doctors said, suffering from an acute psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation, an explanation that my informant found wholly insufficient. They prescribed medication and therapy, but he never spoke a coherent word about what he had seen or heard. He would just sit, endlessly staring at blank walls, occasionally mumbling to himself, just barely audible. And sometimes, those who visited him said, he would let out a low, unsettling laugh, or a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, as if continuing a conversation no one else could hear, as if he was providing responses to questions only he could still perceive. My source, the man with weariness in his eyes, ended his story with a warning. He said that although Victor was no longer in the tunnels, the whispers had never left the station. They were still there, still waiting, perhaps even growing stronger, hungrier. And sometimes, he concluded, if you stand very still on a deserted platform during the late hours, and you listen very closely to the deep rumble of the earth and the sighing of the tunnel winds, you might just hear them. They might even call your name, you understand. They might even call your name. Victor's story is a story about how fear can crawl into your mind, take up residence there, and never let go. It's a horror that has no physical form. But not all subway horrors are so elusive. Some of them leave traces. They paint so that you understand what's happening. This horror, unlike the others, wants to be seen. It wants you to know it exists. And what it knows about you. That's what our last story will be about. You see, it was one of those stories that seeped up from the deep, an echo from the labyrinthine arteries beneath the city. Not a tale you'd read in the headlines, but one whispered in break rooms over cold coffee, or muttered in the hushed silence between train arrivals. It began, as all truly unsettling things often do, with something small, something easily dismissed. It started with the drawings. You can picture it, can't you? The grime of the subway, a perpetual layer clinging to everything, the concrete walls, the steel beams, the very air. But these drawings, they weren't just the usual graffiti tag or a forgotten splotch of oil. They were different. Sketchy, eerie images of human-like figures, elongated and gaunt, always in motion, always dissolving. Their forms seemed to stretch and thin, their limbs blurring as if caught mid-disappearance, fading into the dark maw of the tunnels. They look as if they were drawn with dirt and fuel oil, thick and viscous, leaving a faint, greasy sheen. The peculiar thing was their placement. They'd pop up in the unlikeliest of spots, tucked into alcoves where the surveillance cameras had blind spots, behind utility boxes, high up on ventilation shafts where a person would need a ladder, or down in the grimy service tunnels where only the track workers ventured. You might imagine the initial reaction, annoyance, certainly, and a general shrug of, kids these days. The cleaning crews, already overworked, would be given the instruction to scrub them away. And they did. With steel wool and industrial solvents, they erased the smudges, eradicating the ghostly figures from the station walls. But the next day, they'd be back. More of them. Each time, they were a little larger, a little bolder, a little more numerous. A single disappearing figure would become a pair, then a small procession, all headed for the same, engulfing darkness. It was like a silent, horrifying tide, steadily creeping upwards from the depths. This constant reappearance started to gnaw at the edges of people's minds. There was no direct dialogue among the workers about it at first, of course, just a silent understanding in the way a man would scrub a little harder, or glance over his shoulder a little more often. The station manager, a man called Davies, had reportedly expressed his frustration, telling his supervisors that he simply could not account for how the vandals were repeatedly bypassing security or appearing in such impossible locations. He also mentioned that the images themselves were deeply unsettling. Then, there was driver Tobin. He had been on the late shift for years, one of those quiet men who knew the rhythm of the lines better than his own heartbeat. You'd probably describe him as pragmatic, grounded, the kind of person who'd scoff at ghost stories. But even Tobin had his limits, and the constant appearance of these drawings was starting to wear on him, the unspoken question of how lingering in his mind during his lonely late-night runs. One particularly desolate night, after his final run had pulled into the depot and the last of the passengers had vanished into the city above, Tobin was unusually late. He had been held up by a minor electrical fault in his cab, a flickering light that refused to stay off. He was walking back towards the staff exit, the cavernous silence of the station amplified by the distant hum of the ventilation systems, when he saw it. He later recounted, with a tremor in his voice that was utterly uncharacteristic of him, that it had emerged from the absolute blackness of an auxiliary tunnel entrance, one rarely used except for maintenance. He described it as thin and impossibly tall, a figure that vaguely resembled a person, but not quite. It moved in a way that defied all known physics. It did not walk, not in any conventional sense. Instead, it seemed to slide along the grimy concrete wall, almost gliding, with a disturbing fluidity. He reportedly said that its movements were not like a shadow, but more like a ripple across the surface of still, oily water. As it moved, it left behind dark, viscous traces, fresh smears that were unmistakably the prelude to the drawings that plagued the station. Tobin said that he had frozen, unable to move, his breath caught in his throat. The figure had not seemed to acknowledge his presence. It simply continued its strange, silent ballet along the wall, its form indistinct in the dim emergency lighting, until it reached another dark recess and simply vanished. He also told his colleagues, much later, that the silence it left behind was heavier than the roar of a passing train. It was the silence of something profound and utterly unnatural. He hadn't reported it immediately. How could he? What words would he use? He had simply gone home, the image burned into his retinas, the smell of fuel oil seeming to cling to his clothes. The next morning, new drawings, more intricate and despairing than ever, dotted the very wall where he had seen the things slide. Word of Tobin's encounter, or at least hushed versions of it, began to circulate. And with it, the drawings took on a new, more sinister meaning. No longer were they mere vandalism. They were a calling card, a mark left by something unseen, something deeply wrong. This was when Owen, the young track worker, first came into the picture. Owen was an energetic kid, barely out of his teens, recently transferred from a less demanding line. He was full of youthful bravado, often joking about the spooky stories the old-timers would tell. He had laughed when he overheard one of the cleaning staff complain that they were paying them to scrub down what amounted to childish sketches. He had reportedly scoffed, saying that the real horror was the broken-down signaling equipment. But then, Owen was assigned to a deep tunnel inspection, a section of the line that hadn't seen a full crew in years. It was notorious for its dampness, the rust-colored water constantly dripping from the ceiling. He was down there with a supervisor, checking for hairline cracks in the concrete, when he stumbled upon a new cluster of drawings. These weren't just on the walls. They were on the sleepers, on the ballast, even on the underside of a rusty conduit pipe, smudged into the metal. He recounted later that these figures seemed to be crawling out of the very earth, their empty eye sockets looking up at him. The supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Miller, simply shined his heavy-duty flashlight over them, his face pale, and told Owen, in a hushed tone, that they needed to finish their work quickly. Owen felt a chill, not from the damp, but from the uncharacteristic silence of Miller. The usual dismissive anger was replaced with something like quiet dread. Owen, the young skeptic, began to find himself constantly looking over his shoulder. He reportedly felt a strange, cold presence whenever he was alone in a particularly dark stretch of tunnel. He told a fellow worker one evening that he could almost hear a faint, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone, even when the line was completely shut down. The jokes about ghosts had stopped. This escalating dread eventually drew in Old Man Hudson. Hudson was a legend of the lines, a retired signalman who had spent 45 years underground, the very air of the subway seemingly having permeated his bones. You could say he was haunted by decades underground, not just by memories, but by the accumulated weight of everything the tunnels concealed. He knew the station's every creak and groan, every hidden passage, every forgotten tale. He had reportedly seen things in his time, things he rarely spoke of, his eyes holding a depth that suggested a knowledge far beyond the practical mechanics of the subway. When Tobin, utterly unnerved, finally approached Hudson, seeking some explanation, Hudson had reportedly listened with a quiet intensity. Tobin described the figure. Its impossible movement, the dark traces. Hudson had merely nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He had then recounted, in a low, raspy voice, old stories, almost myths, that were passed down among the oldest hands, tales of the track crawlers, not rats or vagrants, but something else, something that belonged to the deep earth, that fed on forgotten things, on the very despair of the city. He had said that sometimes, when the tunnels ran particularly damp, or when a tragedy occurred, the barrier between their world and what lay beneath became thin. He warned Tobin to be careful, to not look for it looked back. He also told Tobin that the drawings were not just marks, but messages, or maybe even invitations. Tobin, despite his pragmatism, found Hudson's words lodging themselves deep in his mind. He found himself scanning the unmonitored corners, the dark mouths of the service tunnels, with a new, fearful intensity. He began to see the figures in the drawings not as mere stickmen, but as desperate souls, trapped in the purgatory of the underground. He imagined their silent cries, their unending glide into oblivion. The drawings, meanwhile, continued their relentless spread. They were no longer confined to the unmonitored zones. One morning, a particularly disturbing drawing appeared on the glass of a ticket booth, right next to the main entrance, a place visible to dozens of commuters. It was a figure, its arms outstretched, its head thrown back in what looked like a silent scream, its body dissolving into a swirling vortex of dark smudges. The cleaning crew had been unable to remove it entirely. A faint, greasy silhouette remained, a ghostly afterimage. Even Owen, the former skeptic, was now a changed man. He had started to avoid the deeper tunnels if he could help it, always asking for surface assignments. He reportedly confessed to a colleague that he felt as though the drawings were starting to follow him, that he'd sometimes catch a glimpse of a faint, dark smear on a wall where there had been none seconds before. He'd rub at his eyes, convinced it was his imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He had even mentioned feeling a cold breath on his neck once, when he was alone, checking a signal box late at night. The station was no longer just a place of work, it had become a place of dread. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unspoken anxiety. Employees would arrive early, anxious to leave before the last trains, and those on the night shift would move in pairs, their flashlights constantly sweeping the shadowed corners. The drawings had become an accepted, horrifying part of their existence. No one dared to question their origin aloud anymore, nor did they try to erase them with the same vigor. It was as if a silent agreement had been reached, the entity drew, and they simply endured. One week, driver Tobin was again on the late shift. It was a quieter night than usual, the city muffled by a fine, persistent rain. As he guided his empty train into the final station, he caught a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror, not on the platform, but deep within the blackness of the tunnel from which he had just emerged. He knew it was impossible, the lights were off, the track clear. Yet he reportedly said he saw it, a tall, attenuated shadow, not quite fully formed, sliding like ink across the furthest reach of his vision. It was heading his way, down the tunnel towards the station. Tobin didn't stop. He pressed the button to close the doors, his hand shaking, and accelerated out of the station, leaving the faint, ghostly trace of the drawings behind him in the echoing silence. He reportedly knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the entity was no longer just in the unmonitored areas. It was in the station, moving freely, and perhaps it was no longer just drawing pictures. The next morning, a new drawing appeared. It was in the driver's cab, on the inside of the windshield of Tobin's very own train. The figure was more detailed this time, its form almost complete, its face turned towards the viewer, its mouth stretched open in a silent, desperate plea. And you could have sworn it looked just like Old Man Hudson, his eyes wide with an ancient terror, his body dissolving into the familiar, oily smudges, disappearing into the dark. And you might have also heard that Old Man Hudson had not answered his phone that day, or the day after, or any day since. The mystery of the drawings, and the thing that made them, remains. But if you listen closely, when the last train has gone and the city above is quiet, you might just hear the soft, scraping sound, a whisper of something sliding along the walls, deep below. I don't know how much of this is true, and how much is just urban legend. But I do know one thing. After you've heard these stories, you won't look at the subway the same way. You won't look at the darkness of the tunnels the same way. You won't think there's nothing down there. Because you know there's something there. Something waiting. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the hero of one of these stories yourself. Thank you for tonight. I think it's time for us to part ways. We'll meet, if of course we can,